Welcome to Kevs Travel Stories. Each week I'll be bringing you a story from the weird and wonderful world of travel, a world that can change the way you see life and love and even the way we find meaning. Places that are iconic and sometimes surprising and even terrifying. So sit back and enjoy while we go on a magical mystery tour together. Welcome to Kevin's Travel Stories, and I've titled this episode Walking in the Bloody Footsteps. Yes, you may have heard my podcast on Derry, or Londonderry as it was formerly known, and this really is the peak, the pinnacle of a visit to Derry in Northern Ireland. And it is really the most extraordinary morning that you can spend in a destination, and the memory of it stays with me still. And I think it's one of those examples of what's come to be known as dark tourism, where we visit the darker, bloodier spots in human history. Why do we do this? Because we can learn so much. And in a world that is currently on fire, violence that's going on around the world, here is, in a microcosm, an example of why people go to war and how war can be solved. Because the problems that led to Bloody Sunday started, and you can look around the world to see your own examples of this, with the plantation of foreign people into a local area, the discrimination against those that live in that area, and a military solution being imposed on a civilian population. And the results of that came most extraordinarily in Bloody Sunday, that morning and afternoon of January 1972. And I'm going to share what it is like to go on a tour. They do have this tour when you visit Derry in Northern Ireland, and I would strongly recommend you go and visit Derry. The podcast shows what a wonderful, vibrant city it is, but this Bloody Sunday expedition that you can take will really help enliven you. It could even change your views on life and on how we go about sorting out the problem of being human and fighting over our land like we're animals, and we fight for our territory, and sometimes in the most bloody way. So let's have a little look at what actually happens when you go out and you see the fabric of society that has happened. When you do the Bloody Sunday walk, you actually walk in the footsteps of what started as a civil rights march and turned into the biggest mass shooting on the island of Ireland. And it was initiated by a government, an actual established government that had to eventually apologize for the violence that it brought. And when we look around the world, whether it's in the Donbass of Ukraine, whether it's in Gaza or Lebanon, you just fill in, whichever region you're looking at, you fill in the same patterns. So the population of Northern Ireland was displaced, the Catholic population. It was planted in 1613 by an official decree of the British government of the time, and they were going to, because it had been so troublesome taking over Northern Ireland and subjecting it to British rule, that they decided to replace the irritating and troublesome population with English-speaking Protestants from Scotland and from the UK generally. And the locals, who were Catholic and nationalists and Irish, were displaced. They were suppressed. I just ask you to look around the world and just follow the same patterns. So let's look at the actual events of the day, and you'll learn this. When you go, you meet at the Guildhall. We did this on a cold January morning, and it gets very cold in Northern Ireland. This was the same time as the original Bloody Sunday massacre. You meet one of these extraordinary organisers of the talk, who was actually the son of one of the people that were killed. There were 14 people. 13 people died, were shot and died at the actual demonstration. and one died of their wounds later, and many were shot, killed, and beaten. So you go with this gentleman who was so voluble, but you could still feel the rawness in his approach. You could still feel the rawness in how he was dealing with the awful things that had happened to his father. How did the whole Bloody Sunday thing come about? Well, there was a march organised by the Civil Rights Association. There had been internment without trial in Northern Ireland because there had been the nationalists, the Catholic population had risen up and had taken exception to the way that over the centuries, in fact, their rights had been subjected to all sorts of abuse. There was gerrymandering, their votes didn't count when it came to local and general elections, and there was this sense that we have nothing to lose. And this is what happens when you subjugate a population and they have nothing to lose. What do they turn to? Well, they turn to arms. But before we get to that, what the actual things that happened on the day, we went with Paddy, who was leading this tour, and he took us to the actual corner from the Guildhall where the original march, which was then banned, was going to arrive at. And he showed us where the 1st Battalion Parachute, which already had form, it had been involved in the Ballymurphy massacre, and it had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless. It's interesting to note how the Savile inquiry in 1998 found that all the killings were unjustifiable, and everybody who was shot was unarmed, were fleeing, or trying to help those who had been shot. So that was the official British government take on the affairs of that day. In fact, it came that David Cameron, the Prime Minister, apologised for the Bloody Sunday. But of course, that's many years later. And this actual event was so pivotal in the history of the Troubles, it basically led to such a fallout that changed the history of Northern Ireland and the UK. So we then marched and walked with Paddy all the way up to the Free Derry corner. And this was an extraordinary place where the nationalists and their representatives in the provisional and the official IRA had basically barricaded themselves in, and they had stopped the British troops coming. And then there was the Battle of the Bogside, and the barricades were breached and all hell broke loose. And then you had these civil rights demonstrations where people said, OK, we will march. But of course the parades were banned. And on the day of this march, we followed the route where they had encountered the first paras. The official marchers had encountered the first para brigade that were led quite notoriously by Major General Robert Ford. And they were situated in Ebrington Barracks, which we saw, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Wilford. And then at 2:45, on the day of the demonstrations, the march, we followed the route down to where they met the paratroopers. They had to then turn and were going up towards the Russell Flat. And at 3:55, you can actually see the building where the first paratroopers opened fire, and all hell broke loose then. People were fled to the car park in the Russell Flats where more people were shot. You have the very famous picture of the priest, Edward Daly, who one of his friends running beside him was shot in the back, and he put his scarf out and his handkerchief. It's really quite extraordinary when you walk the route with one of the representatives whose family member was killed. As you walk on this cold, bleak route around Free Derry Corner, I remember seeing the bullet holes in the wall. I remember sort of noting the grief of the gentleman who was sharing the story, and the whole informed anger and what happens when you are subjugated and your rights to have a voice are actually taken away from you. And I thought visiting Bloody Sunday and going to the various museums, hearing the recordings, because it was a TV massacre. It was recorded by the British and the foreign press, and you could hear the actual newscasts of the day. You could hear the paras' recordings of them talking to their command. You could hear the gunshots. and you can see the marks on the streets. And it really is quite haunting. And what I took from it is that nowadays it has been resolved. Bloody Sunday led to the revival of the Provisional IRA, or the creation almost of the Provisional IRA, and 20 years of death and destruction and bombing. But eventually, and this is the great story, and it's part of the fabric of Derry and this incredible historical entity that you actually can walk with, and it's so fresh, it's not that many years ago. You get to see, well, not only how we create problems, but how we solve them. Now, I think that's incredibly powerful piece of history. It's an incredibly powerful moment, standing there outside Free Derry and just breathing in a history that informed my past, because I have Irish heritage. I have lived as a UK citizen and now I'm an Irish citizen. I can remember hearing the awfulness of what happened, the original cover-up in the Widgery inquiry. And at that time, I was a British schoolboy, and then growing and coming and living in Ireland as someone who'd had a son who was Irish, and going up and seeing this Bloody Sunday museum and this incredible walk, and getting actually a sense, because I have a foot in both camps, both as a citizen of Great Britain and being brought up there, which is a great heritage for me, and also as this Irish element to my soul as well, and seeing how, thank God, we resolved that awful struggle. And when I look around the world, you see the same thing happening. You see the same steps, this subjugation, this planting of foreign populations, this disenfranchisement of the locals, and of course the bloody rebellion that is inevitable. And I think when we look at the world, this tour of this small part of Northern Ireland, this incredible city of Derry, will really inform you. And what more can you ask from your travel?